Dr. Hensel as our final speaker.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little more about kind of long-term implications, or at least longer-term implications. What's going to happen, or what's possibly going to happen, once we see what happens as a result of this, once we get off the off-ramp that Michael talked about. And I want to focus on international norms. Now, over the last century or so, we've seen the development of what people call a norm of territorial integrity, a norm that borders should be respected and not changed. And this has been part of the charters of the League of Nations, United Nations, the CSCE, OSCE in Europe has several major treaties that incorporate this, which apply to Europe, including this situation. It's also been a big deal for regions like Latin America or Africa, where the idea was in Africa, all these borders are all horribly designed. They were designed by colonizers who had no idea what was where. These borders are all horrible. But the worst thing is fighting a war. So the only thing worse than lots of bad borders is lots of bad borders and millions of dead Africans trying to change them. And so right after Russia invaded Ukraine, the ambassador from Kenya gave a really powerful speech at the UN emphasizing this. You know, Africa didn't fight wars to change all of our horrible borders. We don't respect it. We can't allow this kind of thing to work for the rest of the world. And there's been some debate in international relations and political science about how strong this norm has actually been. So there's an influential article by Zacher a decade or two ago, a couple of decades now, I think, and he suggested that this has been a very strong norm. It developed over the 20th century, and by the mid-1970s, it was widely accepted and strengthening worldwide. And he argued that at the time, there hadn't been a successful major territorial annexation since the 1970s. In the interim time between then and when he wrote the article, the closest was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, which led to a major international response. 30 or so countries reversed it pretty quickly. And he and a lot of other people see this as strengthening the norm and making the point very clearly, we can't change borders by force. Now, since then, there was a successful case of territorial annexation, Crimea. So Vladimir Putin successfully challenged this, took Crimea for Russia, didn't get as much international blowback as Saddam Hussein had with Iraq and Kuwait. Certainly, this led to some of the sanctions. So the sanctions that the West had imposed on Putin after 2014 were based on this, and the West and Ukraine still haven't recognized Crimea as Russian. That's one of the things that I mentioned several times here that Putin wants. Recognize Crimea as ours and not yours. So it's been allowed to go that way, but hasn't been widely accepted or anything by the West. So what is beyond that? What can international relations tell us? Well, there haven't been any major wars over territory that led to successful conquest since the mid-1970s. There have been a lot of smaller things. And so Dan Altman's done some work on this, showing that there's been a fair amount of small combat, small piecemeal acquisitions here and there. You look at islands in the South China Sea, every so often, China will take another island that had been considered Filipino. Some of them militarized to be an incident with two ships around an island somewhere. China and India occasionally will try to grab a little more land along the border, a little piecemeal here, a little bit there. So this territorial integrity norm hasn't fully stopped countries from making territorial demands, but it certainly seems to have reduced large-scale violence and successful acquisition or annexation of territory. Another interesting thing about what Putin's done here is using the West's words, essentially, to try to justify what he's done. So it would have been easy to say, we need to protect the ethnic Russians. Standard irredentist argument going back to at least Italy in the 19th century, where the irredentism comes from. But he didn't do that. He tried to make an argument under the doctrine of responsibility to protect. The idea that the UN passed this unanimously back in 2005 or something like that. And the idea was every country has a responsibility to respect their citizens, human rights, and protect their citizens from genocide and war crimes and things. And if a country doesn't do that, other countries have an obligation to protect them through peaceful means. If that doesn't work, then the UN Security Council has a responsibility to consider on a case-by-case basis intervening to protect those people. And this was a response to things like the ethnic cleansing of Kosovo, this response to Rwanda, some of the disasters of the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. And Putin's kind of using an argument here. Now, a lot of people speculate that had he just tried to just recognize the independence of the two Donbass countries,
take a deep breath.
send a few troops there, enough troops there to protect them from Ukrainian invasion, like is done with Transnistria and Abkhazia, South Ossetia, that there wouldn't have been much of a blowback. But he tried to make this much bigger. He made this more about this genocide against the ethnic Russians and the Nazification of the Ukrainian regime. And so he's trying to make this much bigger than a lot of people speculated he needed. So the question now is, what's going to be the implication of this for future Russian actions or future other potential aggressors who have ethnic kin they want to support in other countries? Well, a lot, of course, depends on what the result is. Obviously, if there'd been a very quick Russian victory with very little cost and they achieved all their objectives, the fear is that would have emboldened a lot of other potential aggressors who disagree with countries on the treatment of their ethnic kin. There are plenty of countries around right now. There are dozens of them, dozens of cases where a country disagrees over how my people are being treated in your country. Everything from as benign as Austria against Italy over ethnic Germans in the former province of South Tyrol, to Hungary against some of its neighbors, of course, Russia, some of its neighbors. So that's one concern, that if Russia had gotten away with this quickly and at low cost, that would really embolden a lot of other people. And it's still possible if Russia gets its way relatively quickly here on in. And they certainly do have a big military advantage over Ukraine over the long term. If this war lasts for months, it's hard to see Ukraine holding on without some major change. So that could still happen. I think a reason to be, or what would have to happen to be more optimistic and not see a lot of emboldened possible aggressors, is either see Russia fail to achieve its goals over the long term, which either means they don't conquer Kyiv, they don't get the demands, they don't get Ukraine to agree to the things they've been demanding them to do, that, or they do it, they put in a puppet regime, and as soon as the Russians withdraw, the puppet's overthrown, or it could just be the costs are so high. So either defeat or failure soon after you withdraw, or a really high cost could really send a message like with Iraq and Kuwait that this is not likely to be a future path for any of you to success. So I think a lot of people are really watching both, will Russia achieve its objectives? And so far they haven't, but they certainly still could, but also at what cost? And that's going to send a signal about what the rest of the international response is going to be, what the response of the international territorial integrity norm is going to be. There seems to be a lot more support. A lot of people really doubted whether there would be Western unity about something like this. And so far, there's been surprising unity among the West, within NATO and the US and plenty of others, in terms of the response to Russia, opposing Russia. Even countries that have been relatively friendly to Russia are so far sticking with the party line in NATO and opposing Russian actions, supporting sanctions, and so on. We'll see if that lasts, because if we start seeing cracks emerge in this Western bloc, the sanctions may not have their bite anymore. So we'll have to watch that as well.